Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie How to Be a Latin Lover, 2017, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. Every once in a while, a film comes along that doesn't just make you laugh, it disarms you. Not with elaborate gags or forced punchlines, but with charm. Pure, chaotic, sun-soaked charm. And this story, it's dipped in it from the first frame. A whirlwind of gold-plated seduction, accidental humility, and outrageous reinvention. It's the kind of film that takes something flashy and wraps it in something deeply human. It begins with a boy who believes in dreams. Dreams not of becoming a hero, or a scholar, or a man of action, but of living in wealth, luxury, and indulgence, without ever having to work a day in his life. And somehow, he pulls it off. At least for a while. Meet Maximo. As a child, he witnessed the crushing defeat of a man, his father, who spent his life working tirelessly, only to end up penniless and forgotten. That moment became a blueprint. Maximo made a vow, not to greatness, but to ease. He would never toil. He would never labor. He would become something else entirely. A master of charm. A connoisseur of seduction. A professional kept man. And through sheer persistence and a face made for telenovelas, he achieves his goal. Fast forward 25 years, and Maximo is living the dream. Or rather, the illusion of one. He's married to a wealthy, elderly woman. He cruises through life in custom suits, gold watches, and an ego that could flatten skyscrapers. He's not a mogul. He's not a genius. But he's built an empire out of manipulation, and he's been sitting comfortably at the top for decades, until it all collapses in one spectacularly cruel moment. Dumped. Replaced by a younger, shinier model with abs that look like they were sculpted in a Marvel casting call. In an instant, Maximo goes from mansion to minivan, from silken robes to polyester nightmares. No fortune. No fallback. No friends. With nowhere else to go, he turns to the only person who still might tolerate him, his estranged sister, Sarah. A hard-working single mom, she lives in a modest house with her young son, Hugo. Maximo arrives at her doorstep like a glittering disaster, dragging a suitcase filled with cologne, hair dye, and delusion. What follows is not just a clash of lifestyles, it's a full-blown cultural collision. Sarah is grounded, fiercely independent, and has no time for her brother's antics. Maximo, meanwhile, is allergic to work, emotionally immature, and more concerned with the mirror than the mortgage. But the most unexpected thing begins to happen. As Maximo stumbles through one humiliating attempt after another to reclaim his lifestyle, seducing rich widows at funerals, staging ridiculous meet-cuties at luxury dealerships, pretending to be blind for sympathy, something small begins to shift. Not in the world, but in him. He starts to care. Not obviously. Not all at once. But in the way he watches Hugo, his wide-eyed nephew who dreams of impressing the smart, shy girl at his school's science fair. Maximo, ever the schemer, sees an opportunity. He decides to help Hugo win her heart, not out of pure generosity, but as a way to worm himself into the social orbit of her grandmother, a fabulously wealthy widow who just might be his ticket back to luxury. It's a plan soaked in selfishness. But somewhere between the fake tutoring sessions and late-night science project rescues, something real flickers through. Maximo, for the first time, feels needed. Not as a lover. Not as a leech. But as an uncle. As family. And it's in these unexpected emotional turns that the film reveals its deeper threads. Because beneath the comedy, the mistaken identities, the bizarre jobs, the poolside misadventures, is a story about worth. About what it means to be useful, to be loved for more than your looks or your lies. About the brutal honesty of starting over when your identity is built on illusions. Of course, this journey isn't without its stumbles. Maximo's attempts to re-enter the world of gold-digging royalty are as outrageous as they are cringe-inducing. He pretends to be an art expert, a grief counselor, a motivational speaker. Each ploy ends in disaster, from broken champagne towers to impromptu stripteases at charity galas. But each failure chips away at the armor. Each embarrassment makes him a little more human, a little more real. And that, oddly enough, makes him likable. The film doesn't just coast on its lead. It surrounds Maximo with a cast of characters that keep the emotional core grounded and the humor sharp. Kristen Bell's presence as a quirky, cat-obsessed frozen yogurt store manager offers some of the film's most absurd and hilarious moments, while Rob Lowe brings an unexpected deadpan to a rival seducer whose lifestyle is somehow even more unhinged than Maximo's. But it's Salma Hayek, as Sarah, who gives the story its weight. Her frustration, her resilience, her fierce love for her son, she grounds the comedy with authenticity. When she looks at Maximo, it's not just disappointment. It's mourning for the brother she once knew. And Hugo, sweet, earnest, beautifully nerdy Hugo, becomes the film's heart. Watching Maximo, for all his vanity and selfishness, begin to genuinely care about this boy is where the story transcends its slapstick roots. It becomes a tale of legacy. Not the legacy of wealth or conquest, but of guidance, of mentorship, of showing up when it matters. There's a turning point that sneaks in quietly. No big speech, no dramatic music. Just a moment when Maximo sees Hugo fail and doesn't gloat, doesn't deflect, doesn't run. He stays. He listens. He comforts. And in that beat, we see the man he could have been all along. Of course, it all builds to a climax that's as chaotic as it is heartfelt. A grand science fair. A last-ditch romantic gambit. A showdown that involves paint, accidental nudity, and a lesson in humility that finally sticks. It's here that everything collides. Maximo's lies, his newfound conscience, Hugo's dreams, Sarah's patience. It explodes in color and confession. And when the dust settles, what remains isn't just resolution. It's a rebirth. Not of the Latin lover, but of the man beneath him. What makes this story linger isn't just the laughter. It's the subtle ache beneath it. The realization that for all his flaws, Maximo isn't a villain. He's a survivor of his own bad choices. A man who learned all the wrong lessons early in life and is now, finally, fumbling toward better ones. He doesn't become a saint. He doesn't give up vanity. But he learns to share the mirror. To reflect not just on himself, but on the people who stood by him when the gold flaked off. In the end, this isn't just a comedy about a gigolo past his prime. It's about redemption that comes slowly, awkwardly, but honestly. It's about how family doesn't always fix you, but it shows you who you are. And maybe, if you're lucky, who you could be. There are twists along the way, of course. Unexpected alliances, shocking reappearances, and a finale that puts Maximo in a place he never expected to be. Not on top, but side by side. With a sister he stopped appreciating. With a nephew who sees the good in him before he ever does. With a future that may not sparkle, but might finally be his. And maybe that's the real lesson in all this madness. Not how to be a Latin lover, but how to be something better. Something real. Something worth loving. Some stories begin with a hero's fall. Others begin with their glory. This one starts with an illusion. Draped in silk sheets and the soft whisper of wealth, a man lies in bed as if born there. Maximo. A name wrapped in gold chains and overconfidence. His life is a curated exhibit of extravagance. Each morning, he is spoon-fed breakfast beside a pool he never cleans, drives cars he doesn't pay for, and wears suits tailored to frame a man whose greatest muscle is his smile. To the world, he is living the dream. To Maximo, he is the dream. But dreams, as they often do, are fragile. He wasn't born into money. Far from it. His earliest memory is of watching his father, broken by labor, crushed beneath the thankless grind of blue-collar work. That image seared itself into his soul. Maximo made a vow, not to suffer, not to serve, but to win. Not through work, but through wit, through charm, through an arsenal of smirks and perfectly calculated gestures. And so, as a young man, he trained not in schools but in salons, in high-end restaurants, in the homes of wealthy, aging women who hungered for attention as much as affection. And then came the moment that shaped it all. He found her. The one. Not a soulmate, but a solution. A wealthy widow, older, lonely, and eager for companionship. He wrapped himself around her life like velvet, soft, comforting, and entirely unchallenging. Years passed. Decades. Maximo aged, but so did she, and with her growing frailty came his growing comfort. He had made it. No job. No schedule. Just massages, shopping sprees, and the occasional forced flirtation in public to keep up appearances. But paradise has a funny way of crumbling overnight. It begins on a morning like any other. The sun rises over a glass estate. Maximo floats in his infinity pool, drink in hand, oblivious. Until she appears. Not with a tray of affection or a gift of affection, but with a suitcase. And a smile that is far too calm. She's found someone new. Someone younger. Someone with abs that could crush diamonds. Maximo doesn't believe it at first. He blinks. He asks if it's a joke. She assures him it's not. He's out. Just like that, his empire vanishes. No assets. No accounts in his name. His credit cards are frozen. His wardrobe becomes an outdated museum of extravagance. With nowhere to go, he turns to the only person who might remember him fondly. His sister. Sarah opens her door to find him standing there with a suitcase full of cologne, a velvet robe, and zero shame. She hasn't seen him in years. Not since their mother's funeral, which he almost missed due to an allergic reaction to economy class. Sarah is everything Maximo isn't, practical, grounded, and exhausted by life's realities. She's raising her son, Hugo, alone, managing a career, a home, and a schedule that leaves no room for grown men who still believe the world owes them. But she lets him in. Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of blood. Or maybe because part of her still remembers the boy Maximo used to be, before the tuxedos, before the tanning beds. He crashes on her couch, surrounded by superhero posters and the scent of real life. Cereal milk, textbooks, and the low hum of responsibility. Maximo is immediately out of place. He treats the living room like a resort lobby. The bathroom becomes his personal spa. He critiques Sarah's furniture, her parenting, her wardrobe. But what irritates her most isn't his arrogance. It's his detachment. He doesn't see Hugo, not really. To Maximo, the boy is a background extra in the drama of his own comeback. But Hugo sees him. Eyes wide, full of curiosity, he watches his uncle like a rare animal. Here is a man who speaks like every sentence is a performance, who walks like mirrors follow him. Hugo is awkward, smart, and deeply unsure of himself. A boy with a heart too big for the world he's in. And he's in love with a girl named Arden, who doesn't know he exists. She's bright, elegant, obsessed with science. She's everything Hugo wishes he could be confident around. But he stumbles in every interaction. Maximo senses an opportunity. One morning, while awkwardly walking Hugo to school in a borrowed t-shirt and slippers, he sees Arden. But more importantly, he sees Arden's grandmother. Elegant, regal, clearly wealthy. And just like that, Maximo's old instincts flicker to life. He decides he'll help Hugo win over Arden. Not because he cares, not really. But because if he can get close to the girl's family, maybe, just maybe, he can find his way back into luxury. He pitches the idea to Hugo like a sacred mission. Operation Impress. They train after school. Maximo teaches Hugo the art of posture, the science of eye contact, the magic of exaggerated compliments. But every lesson is tinted with comedy. Maximo knows nothing about boundaries, less about science, and absolutely nothing about children. The results are disastrous and hilarious. Hugo ends up spilling juice on Arden's project, accidentally insulting her favorite scientist, and once, disastrously, trying to perform an operatic love song in the school cafeteria. Yet something begins to shift. Maximo, for all his blunders, starts to care. He starts to root for Hugo, not just as a means to an end, but as a reflection of himself. He sees the kid's insecurities, his heart, his hunger to be seen. And slowly, for the first time in years, Maximo does something alien to him. He listens. He apologizes. He tries. Of course, Maximo's larger plans are still in motion. He begins inserting himself into the lives of the school's wealthiest parents. He fabricates elaborate stories about being a widower. He volunteers at the school, posing as a motivational speaker. At one point, he's mistakenly assigned to lead a dance class, resulting in a spectacularly chaotic display of salsa, confusion, and a pulled hamstring. Meanwhile, Sarah watches all of this with a mix of horror and reluctant amusement. Her brother is a tornado, a man who leaves drama in every room he enters. But Hugo is laughing more, talking more, standing taller. And as much as she wants to believe Maximo is still the same self-absorbed charlatan he's always been, she begins to wonder, could he actually be changing? But change isn't easy. Or clean. Maximo's schemes start to catch up with him. He overplays his hand at a widow's charity luncheon, getting caught in a lie about owning a vineyard. He tries to crash a billionaire's yacht party disguised as a masseuse, only to be thrown overboard. And his reputation starts to spread, not as a Latin lover, but as a walking catastrophe. Still, in the chaos, a bond deepens between Maximo and Hugo. One night, after a failed attempt to teach Hugo how to flirt using pickup lines from old soap operas, they collapse onto the couch laughing. No masks. No angles. Just two people, trying to figure out who they are. Maximo admits something he's never said aloud, that he doesn't know how to be normal. That he's scared. That underneath all the bravado is a man who never learned how to be anything else. And Hugo, in his quiet way, forgives him. It's in that fragile honesty that the story finds its pulse. Because this isn't just a comedy about a man trying to get rich again. It's about a man trying to get right again. To reconnect with the family he left behind. To become someone worth being, not just someone worth buying. But as with all stories of second chances, the past doesn't go quietly. And just when Maximo starts to settle into this new life, into something resembling growth, something from the glittering world he once ruled comes back. And everything begins to tilt once more. The world Maximo had grown strangely comfortable in, the modest one with creaky floors, school runs, and unpaid bills, was beginning to feel real. Not just a layover, not a punishment, but something with weight. And just as he started to lean into this unlikely life, something shimmered from his past. A crack of gold in the drywall of normalcy. A ghost from the world he once ruled. Celia, one of the wealthiest widows in the social stratosphere he used to orbit, re-entered the picture. Elegant, fierce, and endlessly flirted with, she had heard about Maximo's transformation. Word had spread, slightly warped, wildly exaggerated, that he'd turned over a new leaf. That he was mentoring children, volunteering, even leading school assemblies with rousing speeches about self-worth. None of it was entirely true. But none of it was false enough to deny. She invited him to lunch. Not just any lunch, a high-society luncheon at a hilltop estate filled with old money and new Botox. Maximo dusted off the last of his good shoes, borrowed a blazer from a neighbor 3 sizes too small, and returned to the stage he thought he'd lost forever. For a few glorious hours, he was back. He glided through conversations, delivered charmingly vague anecdotes about charity work, complemented outfits with surgical precision. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself. Or at least, the version of himself he used to be. When Celia leaned in and hinted that she might be looking for companionship again, Maximo saw the gates of heaven swing open. His ticket back to silk sheets, private chefs, and valet parking had arrived. But something caught in his throat. Not a word. Not a moment. A memory. Of Hugo, standing alone at recess, clutching a science kit. Of Sarah, tired but smiling at the dinner table, her hand resting gently on her son's shoulder. Of the family photo they had taken, him included, awkward and stiff, but there. That memory didn't scream. It whispered. And in that whisper was hesitation. Still, the opportunity was too good. He began splitting himself in two. By day, he tutored Hugo, helped him prepare for the science fair, read books he didn't understand about gravity and propulsion. By night, he courted Celia, wearing a mask so perfectly polished it reflected nothing but charm. He was juggling lives, timelines, expectations. And like all illusions, it started to fracture. It was Hugo who noticed first. The tutoring sessions grew shorter. The advice less thoughtful. Maximo began checking his phone mid-sentence. Missing family dinners. Arriving late to school events. The boy who had once looked at him like a hero now watched him with quiet confusion. And then came the day of the science fair. It should have been simple. Hugo had built a remarkable project, a miniature engine powered by salt water, something no one in the class had attempted. He was nervous, pacing in his oversized suit, hoping Maximo would be there to help set it up. They had practiced the presentation together, rehearsed the lines, even picked out a tie. But Maximo wasn't there. He was across town, seated at Celia's side in a luxury box at a charity gala, wearing a new suit, laughing, sipping wine he couldn't pronounce. And even as the laughter rang around him, something was wrong. The music felt distant. The conversations, hollow. A part of him was somewhere else. And then, without warning, he stood up. He left. Rushed through valet, stripped off the name tag that read "Esteemed Guest," and jumped into a taxi that smelled like wet dog and urgency. He arrived at the school just in time to see Hugo, standing beside his project, alone. His shoulders low. His eyes glassy. The judges had already passed. Awards were being handed out. And Maximo had missed it. The silence between them was unbearable. Hugo didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just looked up and said, "It's okay." Which, of course, made it worse. Back at home, Sarah was waiting. She didn't speak either. She just looked at her brother, the man who had made her son believe in himself, and then reminded him why hope is dangerous. She didn't need to say anything. Her disappointment wrapped around the room like fog. Maximo tried to explain. He tried to say that he hadn't meant to miss it, that he had changed, that he was changing. But words were weightless now. And so, he left. Not with a bang. Not in anger. Quietly. He packed the same suitcase he had arrived with, now filled with far fewer illusions, and slipped out the door. What followed was a strange sort of exile. He bounced from place to place, crashing on couches, applying for jobs he was comically unqualified for. He tried to be a valet. Got fired in 2 hours. Tried to sell timeshares. Sold none. Finally, he landed as a children's party entertainer. In a costume. With a tail. Singing songs about responsibility while being pelted with cupcakes. It was humiliating. But strangely, it was honest. He made just enough money to buy a second-hand blazer and a toy telescope. He cleaned the telescope himself. Wrapped it in tissue paper. And one evening, weeks after the science fair, he knocked on Sarah's door. She opened it. No words. Just stillness. He handed her the telescope. For Hugo, he said. I thought he might like to look at something bigger than disappointment. Sarah didn't laugh, but she let him in. Inside, Hugo sat at the kitchen table, building something with wire and batteries. He looked up. Maximo sat across from him, quietly. No speeches, no jokes, just presence. And slowly, forgiveness began to bloom. What followed wasn't a miracle. It was work. Day by day, Maximo rebuilt what he had broken. He walked Hugo to school, helped with projects, cooked, with disastrous results. He took on more party gigs, one of which included singing Let It Go while dressed as a knockoff Disney prince. He stopped talking about getting rich again. He stopped pretending he was better than the life he had. And then, one day, he was invited back to the school, not as a guest, not as a joke, but as a speaker. Hugo had nominated him. Not because he was perfect, but because he'd kept showing up. Maximo stood in front of the class, fidgeting with his notes. Then, with no warning, he dropped them. And he told the truth. He talked about failure, about pretending, about what it feels like to believe that love only comes with luxury. He said he used to think charm could fix everything, that wealth could make you worthy. But then he met a kid who taught him that being real, flawed, awkward, present, is more valuable than anything money can buy. The room was silent. Then came applause. Hesitant at first. Then thunderous. Afterward, Maximo and Hugo walked home. No big speeches. Just laughter, and the quiet joy of two people who had become family by choice, not just blood. And though the old Maximo never truly died, he still winked at himself in mirrors, still wore too much cologne. Something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer trying to be someone else. He was trying to be someone better. Not a Latin lover. Just a man worth loving. Every character in this story, beneath the surface-level gags and bursts of exaggerated charm, carries a quiet emotional weight, something far more sincere than the trailers ever promised. What starts as a loud, comedic satire of vanity and seduction slowly transforms into a reflection of identity, resilience, and redemption. The cast of personalities that surround the chaos are not just satellites orbiting a central punchline. They are constellations, each with their own gravity, their own contradictions, their own unexpected depth. Maximo is the obvious star, and yet he's not the man he pretends to be when we first meet him. The opening chapters of his life are built on an illusion so meticulously constructed that even he seems to believe it. That charm is currency, that beauty is power, and that if you never learn to love deeply, you never risk heartbreak. He's not evil. He's not even particularly cunning. He's a man terrified of mediocrity, shaped by a childhood where hard work led his father nowhere but obscurity. So Maximo chose a different path, one where success looked like silk bedsheets and vintage convertibles, and where the only thing that mattered was staying young, wanted, and very well moisturized. But as the story unfolds, the shine begins to wear thin. What makes Maximo compelling is not his downfall, but how he reacts to it. When stripped of all luxury, when faced with the mundane reality of sleeping on a pull-out couch surrounded by superheroes and cereal boxes, he doesn't collapse, at least, not immediately. Instead, he clings to the old performance, the habits of seduction and superiority. It's only when he begins to see himself reflected in the eyes of his nephew that something starts to change. It's not a clean arc. He stumbles, backslides, makes promises he can't keep. But slowly, humorously, sincerely, he becomes someone new. Not because he has to, but because for the first time he wants to. His evolution is not about abandoning who he was, but learning to peel away the armor. To be more than the Latin lover. To be an uncle. A brother. A man who shows up. And then there's Sarah. If Maximo is a man running from reality, Sarah is the woman who holds it together with bare hands and stubborn grace. She is not flashy. She is not in need of saving. She is the kind of person who doesn't flinch when life disappoints her, but quietly absorbs the blow and keeps moving. Her relationship with Maximo is one defined by distance and pain, not just because he left, but because he never looked back. She raised Hugo alone, built a life, and now here he is again, sweeping in with hair gel and disaster, expecting the world to wait on him. Yet Sarah never hardens into bitterness. That's what makes her so remarkable. She doesn't lash out. She doesn't drown Maximo in guilt. Instead, she offers him space, just enough to fall, to stumble, to try. Her strength is quiet, uncelebrated, but it runs through every moment. In the way she softens when Maximo finally shows vulnerability. In the way she protects Hugo without stifling him. In the way she sees people clearly, but never fully gives up on them. Through Sarah, the film grounds itself. No matter how outrageous the comedy becomes, she brings it back to something raw, something real. Her eyes tell stories that the script never needs to speak. And when she forgives Maximo, not with a grand speech, but with a look, an open door, it lands with the weight of 1,000 second chances. Then there's Hugo, the heartbeat of it all. He is not loud. He is not suave. He is not the kind of child molded by movie tropes. Hugo is kind, earnest, a little lost, a lot brilliant. He is a boy who builds engines from soda cans and studies black holes in his free time. A boy who has no idea how to talk to the girl he likes, but who would move planets just to make her smile. Hugo is everything Maximo isn't, pure, hopeful, awkwardly honest. And yet, the bond that forms between them feels destined. It begins in fits and starts. Maximo doesn't know how to speak to children. He talks at Hugo, not with him. But Hugo listens anyway. Because even in Maximo's mess, there's something magnetic. And over time, that magnetic pull becomes mutual. Hugo learns confidence, not from Maximo's outdated playbook of seduction, but from his persistence. His uncle may be terrible at science, but he shows up, again and again. And for a boy who's used to being overlooked, that matters. In teaching Hugo how to win a girl, Maximo ends up teaching himself how to love someone without needing to be loved in return. And Hugo, in return, gives Maximo something far more valuable than a way back into wealth. He gives him a reason to stay. On the fringes of this makeshift family are characters who seem like caricatures at first glance, but who each serve as reflections of the world Maximo used to inhabit. Kristen Bell's character, eccentric, awkward, obsessively attached to her cats, is not just comic relief. She is, in many ways, a mirror of Maximo's worst fear, a person who lives in obscurity, unnoticed, unglamorous. But where Maximo fears that fate, she embraces it. She is unapologetically herself, and though she exists largely to make us laugh, her odd presence becomes a small, constant reminder that being seen doesn't always require being admired. Then there's Celia, the glamorous widow who offers Maximo a way back into his old life. She is not unkind. She is smart, powerful, and perfectly aware of her position. But she exists in a world where affection is currency and appearances are armor. She and Maximo speak the same language, flirt with the same stakes. But their chemistry lacks heart. When Maximo tries to return to that world through her, it becomes clear that what he once craved now feels hollow. Celia is not a villain. But she represents a path. One that Maximo almost walks again, but chooses to leave behind. And that choice, quiet, internal, without fanfare, is the moment he becomes a character worth remembering. Because what this story does so well is unravel its people, not through tragedy or betrayal, but through inconvenience, through discomfort, through the slow, absurd, deeply human process of change. It makes room for its characters to fail without condemning them, to learn without becoming entirely new, to grow without becoming unrecognizable. By the time the story closes, none of the characters are who they were. Maximo is still vain. He still winks at himself in windows. Still wears shirts unbuttoned just a little too far. But he holds Hugo's backpack without being asked. He calls Sarah just to check in. He takes birthday party gigs not because he has to, but because it lets him be part of something. He's not a completely different man. But he is a better one. Sarah finds peace not in her brother's transformation, but in the quiet comfort of having someone beside her. She doesn't need to be rescued. But it's nice to not be alone in the weight of everyday life. And Hugo walks a little taller. Speaks a little louder. He didn't get the girl with a speech or a stunt. He got her with kindness, with persistence, with honesty. Just like the man he helped his uncle become. In the end, it's not a story about wealth or romance or reinvention. Held at a small Mexican restaurant near the final shooting location, it wasn't a grand affair. But it was filled with stories. The parrot handler gave a speech. Kristen Bell performed a parody ballad about frozen yogurt. The lead actor stood up, glass in hand, and thanked the cast not for making a comedy, but for helping him make something with heart. Something that made people laugh and feel. Something he had wanted to do his entire career. In the end, what makes this film's behind-the-scenes journey so fascinating isn't just the absurdity. The parrots, the parades of polyester, the fire alarms in the middle of emotional beats, but the quiet intention behind the madness. Everyone on that set, from the seasoned leads to the first-time child actors, understood that beneath the glitter and jokes was a story about family. About people who fail each other and then show up anyway. About finding your worth not in wealth or seduction, but in service, in presence, in love. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the movie still resonates. Not because it was perfect, but because even in its strangest, most unpredictable moments, it remembered to be real. There are comedies that simply aim to entertain, to tickle the ribs and leave the mind untouched. Then there are those that take on something subtler, that use laughter as a kind of misdirection, a soft veil over themes that might otherwise feel too vulnerable, too real. This story, on its surface, arrives as a flashy parody of male vanity, a satire of wealth and shallow seduction. But beneath the speedos and spray tans, something more grounded is happening. Something that pulses gently through its story, never shouted but always present. Something that, from a critical lens, reshapes how the film should be seen, not just as a comedy, but as a character-driven exploration of reinvention, resilience, and the unexpectedly redemptive power of family. To understand its heart, we must first look at the collapse. Maximo's downfall isn't just the inciting incident, it's the thesis. The idea that the life he built, the persona he perfected, was never truly stable. In the film's early moments, he is a monument to superficial success. He's surrounded by wealth, yes, but it's inherited wealth. Borrowed, not earned. Every part of his identity depends on being desired, admired, and above all, taken care of. But when he is replaced, so easily and so brutally, by a younger man with better abs and zero wrinkles, the illusion shatters. From a critical standpoint, this moment is not just comedic, it's surgical. It unravels a myth that masculinity, especially aging masculinity, can cling to desirability forever. It paints charm as currency, but also as a fragile one, subject to expiration. That fragility sets the stage for the film's most significant shift, from satire to sincerity. When Maximo lands, broke and abandoned, on his sister's doorstep, the movie begins to restructure itself. Critics often call this pivot predictable, but to do so misses its nuance. What happens next is not just a fish-out-of-water comedy. It's a confrontation with roots. With the people we leave behind when we choose ambition over authenticity. Sarah is not just a counterpoint to Maximo. She is the echo of the life he abandoned. A hard-working, practical, emotionally intelligent woman who never stopped moving forward, even when no one applauded her for it. Her presence in the film, underappreciated in many early reviews, is essential. She grounds the tone. Every absurdity, Every ridiculous plan Maximo launches is refracted through her quiet, unimpressed lens. And in doing so, the film tells us, this may be comedy, but it's not nonsense. The relationship between Maximo and Hugo, though, is where the story finds its emotional resonance. From a thematic perspective, their bond is the most organic arc in the film. Maximo doesn't set out to be a mentor. He sets out to use Hugo as a stepping stone, a way back into the world of wealth through a romantic connection to the girl's rich grandmother. But along the way, something rare happens in mainstream comedy. Sincerity seeps in. Slowly, unexpectedly, and without fanfare. Hugo, awkward and gentle, doesn't ask for guidance. He simply listens, watches, learns. And what he mirrors back to Maximo is not the reflection of a Latin lover, but of a man trying to matter. One of the film's most understated triumphs lies in how it handles that transition. From a critical standpoint, the shift in Maximo isn't complete, and that's what makes it effective. He doesn't become a saint. He doesn't abandon vanity. He still wears his shirts unbuttoned too far down, still smirks at his reflection. But he learns to listen, to show up, and that, particularly in stories about redemption, is more honest than transformation. It speaks to the idea that growth doesn't mean reinvention. It means recalibration. A better version of who we already are, not a brand new identity. Another event that plays a critical role in shaping both plot and perspective is the science fair. Narratively, it's the climax of Hugo's arc. But thematically, it's a crucible for Maximo. When he misses the moment, when he arrives too late, the silence that follows isn't played for drama. It's soaked in quiet failure. This scene, often overshadowed by louder comedic beats, deserves more attention from critical analysis. It's not about grand gestures. It's about the smallness of letting someone down. And the rarity of having to live with that. Here, the film dares to pause. To let the comedy recede, to let discomfort sit in the room. For Maximo, this is the turning point. Not when he delivers a speech or wins someone back, but when he realizes his absence hurt. And in that moment, the film delivers its thesis. Being loved isn't about being impressive. It's about being present. From the perspective of genre expectations, this pivot is bold. Audiences come for the laughs, of which there are many. But what they leave with is something more disarming, a reflection on legacy. Not the legacy of wealth or conquest, but of kindness, of connection. Critics who dismissed the film as shallow may have overlooked the intentional subversion at work. The humor acts as a spoonful of sugar, but what it's delivering is a commentary on aging masculinity, on the pressure to perform, on the myth of self-worth being tied to sex appeal. And then there's Sarah. Her arc, though quieter, is equally significant. She is the voice of reason, yes. But she is also a portrait of single motherhood rarely seen with this kind of balance. She is not perfect. She snaps. She doubts. She keeps her walls high. But she is never reduced to a stereotype. Her forgiveness, when it finally comes, is not a reward. It is a choice. And her strength doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from her refusal to abandon her boundaries. She does not become softer to accommodate Maximo. Instead, he becomes gentler to meet her where she already is. From a thematic perspective, that's a reversal worth praising. Too often, stories of family redemption demand that the wounded become the bridge. But here, the one who left has to build it. And that says something profound, not just about narrative justice, but about accountability. Critically speaking, the film's visual language doesn't draw attention to itself. But there are subtle cues, small visual metaphors, that shape how we interpret events. Maximo's costuming shifts from peacock feathers to neutral tones. The lighting in Sarah's home is warm, practical, while the lighting in Maximo's old life is sterile and grand. These contrasts are not accidental. They guide us, without ever shouting, toward the emotional truth. Where there is warmth, there is honesty. Where there is glitter, there is artifice. Reception-wise, the film landed in a peculiar space. Mainstream critics were divided. Some saw it as a broad comedy with little depth. Others recognized the layers hidden beneath the surface. But among audiences, something different happened. The film developed a following not because it was perfect, but because it was human. People related to its characters, its stumbles, its message. They laughed, yes, but they also saw themselves. In the brother trying to make amends. In the sister doing everything alone. In the child waiting to be chosen. And maybe that's the most significant impact of all. This is not a film that shouts its morals. It doesn't preach. It fumbles. It jokes. It stumbles through its themes the same way Maximo stumbles through parenthood, through responsibility, through redemption. But in doing so, it becomes more than a comedy. It becomes a mirror, not of who we want to be, but of who we are when no one's watching, of the things we forget to say, the people we take for granted, the quiet, aching hope that it's not too late to be better. And in that light, every laugh becomes something more. It becomes a lifeline, a reminder that even in the most absurd moments, something true can shine through. Some films are built in silence, careful compositions, rehearsed emotions, and a tight grip on control. Others are constructed in chaos, in laughter between takes, in last-minute rewrites and jokes that start as throwaways and somehow make it all the way into the final cut. This film was one of the latter. It wasn't born in a vacuum of precision, but in the unpredictable energy of collaboration, improvisation, and the strange, often hilarious messiness that comes with trying to bring a story this absurd and strangely touching to life. It all started with a script that had to walk a tightrope, one balancing the satire of a man-child gigolo with the sincerity of family redemption. On paper, that kind of duality shouldn't work. And yet, that contrast was exactly what drew the creative team in. From the earliest stages of development, the filmmakers knew they wanted to play with expectation. They weren't just spoofing vanity, they were exposing it. Not just mocking aging masculinity, but gently, sometimes painfully, exploring what it means to have built a life around being wanted, only to discover that kind of appeal doesn't last forever. Casting was the first miracle. Landing Eugenio Derbez in the lead role brought a whirlwind of possibility. Known throughout Latin America for his legendary comedic timing and knack for emotional nuance, Derbez was already a household name. But in the U.S. market, especially in English-language films, he was still emerging. This project became the bridge. And he wasn't just starring, he was producing, shaping the tone, guiding the heart. Every decision he made was intentional. Maximo couldn't just be a joke. He had to be someone audiences could root for, even as they laughed at him. That balance informed everything, from how he delivered lines to how he wore each ridiculous outfit. And speaking of outfits, Maximo's wardrobe was its own production. The costume designer, Salvador Perez, worked alongside Derbez to create looks that would be both hilarious and painfully believable. No cartoon gigolo costumes here. These were based on real trends. Deep V-necks, designer loafers without socks, overly tight pants, and jewelry that shimmered a little too loudly. They raided fashion archives, scoured photos of aging influencers, and created what they lovingly referred to as the Latin Lover Lookbook. Derbez was fitted in over 50 wardrobe options before the final 10 were selected. One silk shirt, an electric blue number with gold trim, was so eye-catching that crew members had to remove reflective props from the set because the shirt was bouncing light directly into the lens. And then there was Kristen Bell. She was originally brought in for a cameo. A quirky little moment, no more than a few lines. But the minute she walked onto the set of her character's frozen yogurt shop, everything changed. Her improvisation was electric. She crafted an entire backstory on the spot. Cat-obsessed, coupon clipping, slightly unhinged, and the cast couldn't stop laughing. The director, Ken Marino, rewrote 3 scenes that night just to bring her back. The photos of her real-life cats used as set decoration? Her idea. The scene where she tries to seduce Maximo using a loyalty card? Improvised from start to finish. Belle's ability to turn a walk-on role into a comedic high point remains one of the production's favorite surprises. Working with Ken Marino as director brought its own unique rhythm to the production. Marino was no stranger to comedy, but this was one of his most ambitious projects. He approached it like a party with purpose. Sets were high-energy, relaxed, and full of laughter, but always moving forward. Marino encouraged improvisation constantly. Every scene was shot with at least one safety take and one play take, where actors could go completely off-script. Some of the film's most memorable lines and physical comedy came from those unscripted moments. In fact, during a montage where Maximo tries out a series of disastrous jobs, nearly the entire sequence was created from these play takes. One shot, of Maximo falling off a Segway while delivering a pizza, was so unexpected that the camera operator had to stifle his laughter to keep the shot usable. Even the child actors were pulled into the fun. Raoul, who played Hugo, was new to film but incredibly sharp. Derbez took him under his wing from day one. Between takes, they played word games, practiced impressions, and developed their own handshake, which eventually made it into the film during a sweet moment after a science fair scene. That scene, by the way, was a logistical marathon. It involved hundreds of extras, dozens of homemade science projects, and a fire alarm that accidentally went off in the middle of shooting. Instead of cutting, Marino kept rolling. Derbez, in character, pulled Hugo under a table and started pretending they were escaping a lab explosion. The footage was later used in a gag reel that had the entire crew in tears from laughter. The production design was filled with little touches that spoke volumes about character. Sarah's home, for instance, was a real house, lived in and cozy. The art department filled it with real family photos from crew members, homemade drawings, half-full coffee mugs, and slightly worn cushions. They wanted it to feel lived in contrast to the cold, opulent luxury Maximo was kicked out of. That mansion, by the way, was a rented estate owned by a real-life fashion mogul, and the crew had to follow strict rules. No shoes inside, no food near the art, and absolutely no touching the zebra rug in the foyer. One intern reportedly spent 4 hours guarding that rug while a dance scene was filmed nearby. But not everything went smoothly. Sarah's home, for instance, was a real house, lived in and cozy. The art department filled it with real family photos from crew members, homemade drawings, half-full coffee mugs, and slightly worn cushions. They wanted it to feel lived in contrast to the cold, opulent luxury Maximo was kicked out of. That mansion, by the way, was a rented estate owned by a real-life fashion mogul, and the crew had to follow strict rules. No shoes inside, no food near the art, and absolutely no touching the zebra rug in the foyer. One intern reportedly spent 4 hours guarding that rug while a dance scene was filmed nearby. But not everything went smoothly. During a shoot at an outdoor car dealership, intended for a scene where Maximo pretends to be a wealthy art dealer, a real customer wandered into frame and began negotiating for a car with one of the background actors. No one noticed for nearly a minute. The footage, complete with improvised sales banter and the customer's genuine confusion, became an inside joke among the editors. Another day, while shooting a pool scene at a lavish country club, a thunderstorm rolled in and forced the crew to evacuate mid-shot. Derbez, still wearing a gold-trimmed Speedo and no shoes, was caught in the downpour and slipped into the pool. His timing was so perfect that the footage was saved, reworked, and turned into a sequence showing Maximo's literal fall from grace. One of the more quietly powerful moments of the production came during a late-night shoot between Sarah and Maximo, a dialogue-heavy scene set in the kitchen. The scene involved no comedy, just two siblings trying to bridge years of resentment. Derbez and Salma Hayek had known each other for years but had never performed a scene like this, raw, vulnerable, and stripped of spectacle. The room was closed off. Lights low. The crew operated in silence. When the scene wrapped, no one moved. It was quiet in a way that only comes when something real has just happened. Hayek later said it was one of her favorite scenes she'd ever filmed, not because of its drama, but because of its honesty. When the film finally wrapped, the cast and crew held a small ceremony. Nothing flashy, just a rented food truck, a karaoke machine, and stories passed around like currency. Derbez gave a speech, emotional and light, thanking everyone for not just helping him tell a story, but helping him tell his story. For him, the film was more than a comedy. It was a cultural bridge, a way to bring a specific kind of humor, a specific kind of heart, to a wider audience. And it worked. The film may not have shattered box office records, but its legacy lives in something deeper. In the way audiences connected with it. In the emails and letters from viewers who saw their own families in Sarah's strength, their own confusion in Maximo's fall, their own quiet bravery in Hugo's heart. It lives in the laughter shared in post-production rooms and the friendships formed across sound stages. It lives in the silly things, the shirts, the parrot that never made it to the final cut, the wig that went missing for 3 days and was found on the catering truck. Most of all, it lives in the reminder that comedy, when built with love, can hold more than punchlines. It can hold people. And that is what this film did. One improvised line, one glittering disaster, one heartfelt redemption at a time. Every great comedy has a rhythm, a visual heartbeat pulsing beneath the jokes, anchoring the laughter in a world that feels just real enough to believe in. And in this story, a film draped in gold chains, heartbreak, and accidental redemption, the setting doesn't just serve as a backdrop. It moves with the characters, reshapes itself with every fall and every flicker of growth. From opulent mansions to sun-drenched sidewalks, every location breathes tone into the story, slipping seamlessly between absurdity and sincerity, luxury and love. It begins in a fantasy. Not the kind built on dragons or distant planets, but the fantasy of a man who's built his entire identity on being adored. Maximo's world opens with marble floors, polished staircases, and the kind of furniture you're not supposed to sit on. His mansion is more than a home, it's a shrine to surface-level living. And the production design leans fully into that symbolism. Everything gleams. There are no shadows. The lighting is pristine, like an infomercial or a dream sequence. This is the temple of a man who has never questioned the value of charm or the security of seduction. But there's something uncanny about the space. It's too clean. Too perfect. Like a showroom where no one actually lives. The cinematography reflects that perfection with clinical precision. The camera glides, never shakes. It observes Maximo with a kind of smug detachment, framing him as both king and clown. In these early moments, director of photography John Bailey keeps the visual language sharp and symmetrical. Maximo is always centered, always lit like a cologne ad. The artificiality is intentional. It's the visual manifestation of his ego. The world bends to his self-image. But that world collapses quickly, and when it does, so does the visual rhythm. From the moment Maximo is thrown out of his paradise, the film's aesthetic begins to unravel. The lighting grows softer, warmer. The settings shift from echoing estates to spaces cluttered with real life. Sarah's house, where Maximo is reluctantly welcomed, becomes the film's emotional core, and its visual reset. It is not a set piece of aspiration, but one of routine. The kitchen hums with activity. The walls are decorated with handmade crafts and faded photographs. Toys are scattered across the floor. Every detail feels lived in. The production design here tells us everything we need to know about Sarah. She is practical, busy, and utterly grounded. Her house isn't picture-perfect, but it radiates warmth. The lighting shifts dramatically in this space. Golden tones dominate. Natural light filters through windows left open. At night, the glow of table lamps replaces overhead fixtures, casting soft halos around the characters. This is not Maximo's world. It's real, and it's humbling. And as Maximo stumbles through this new life, the camera follows suit. The compositions loosen. The camera begins to shake slightly during chaotic moments. It tracks him awkwardly through small doorways, often catching him mid-gesture, half-cut from the frame. The cinematography becomes more observational, less curated. It mirrors his discomfort, his lack of control. And with each frame, we feel the tension between who Maximo was and who he might become. But the film doesn't trap itself in domesticity. It ventures out, into city sidewalks, local schools, strip malls, and car dealerships. The locations chosen are distinctly ordinary, but shot with affection. The school where Hugo learns and dreams is bright, filled with posters and art projects. The science fair, in particular, becomes a visual turning point. Shot with wide lenses and deep focus, it becomes a stage where fantasy and reality collide. The chaos of children, the hum of excitement, the nervous clatter of folding chairs, it all builds to a moment of genuine emotional tension. And when Maximo fails to show up on time, the light in the frame dims almost imperceptibly. It's not darkness, it's disappointment. The camera lingers just a second too long on Hugo's face, framed beneath a papier-mâché volcano and flickering fluorescent light. The camera begins to shake slightly during chaotic moments. It tracks him awkwardly through small doorways, often catching him mid-gesture, half-cut from the frame. The cinematography becomes more observational, less curated. It mirrors his discomfort, his lack of control. And with each frame, we feel the tension between who Maximo was and who he might become. But the film doesn't trap itself in domesticity. It ventures out, into city sidewalks, local schools, strip malls, and car dealerships. The locations chosen are distinctly ordinary, but shot with affection. The school where Hugo learns and dreams is bright, filled with posters and art projects. The science fair, in particular, becomes a visual turning point. Shot with wide lenses and deep focus, it becomes a stage where fantasy and reality collide. The chaos of children, the hum of excitement, the nervous clatter of folding chairs, it all builds to a moment of genuine emotional tension. And when Maximo fails to show up on time, the light in the frame dims almost imperceptibly. It's not darkness, it's disappointment. The camera lingers just a second too long on Hugo's face, framed beneath a papier-mâché volcano and flickering fluorescent light. There are no sweeping score cues, no dramatic angles. Just stillness, resignation. And it hits harder because the visuals don't try to tell us what to feel, they simply let us witness it. Then there are the fantasy sequences. Moments where Maximo imagines his return to glory, walking into parties in slow motion, descending escalators surrounded by models, giving interviews on fake talk shows. These scenes are where the cinematography stretches into parody. Overhead lighting flares like halos. Lenses widen to distort the world into something dreamlike. In one unforgettable moment, Maximo imagines himself giving a TED Talk about seduction, with fog machines, spotlights, and a crowd of swooning fans. It's ridiculous, but the lighting, the camera work, the slow motion pushes make it feel real to him. That's the magic of these sequences. They don't just show us fantasy. They show us his fantasy. And that makes the eventual fall all the more powerful. Color is another tool the filmmakers use with care. Maximo's wardrobe starts in bold, glossy tones, sapphire blues, golds, crisp whites. He stands out in every frame. But as his arc progresses, the colors around him begin to soften. He wears more muted tones. His hair loses its perfect gel hold. He begins to blend into his surroundings. Not because he's disappearing, but because he's becoming part of something larger than himself. The world no longer orbits Maximo. He orbits it. Even small visual motifs help shape the story. Mirrors, for example, appear throughout the film, first as tools of vanity, then as instruments of self-awareness. In the mansion, Maximo checks his reflection constantly. He performs for it. But in Sarah's house, the only mirror is above the bathroom sink, unflattering, harshly lit. and he begins to avoid it. Later, when he finally looks into it after failing Hugo, he doesn't adjust his hair. He just stares. It's a quiet moment. No dialogue. But the framing is tight, centered, honest. And in that reflection, we see the man beneath the illusion. Sound design plays a surprisingly important role in the atmosphere as well. In Maximo's luxurious early life, everything is quiet. Too quiet. The soundscape is filled with faint classical music, the hum of distant waterfalls, and the rustle of satin. But in Sarah's world, life is noisy. Dishes clatter. Doors creak. Neighbors shout. The refrigerator buzzes. These sounds aren't distractions. They are life. They build a sense of presence, of belonging. And Maximo, used to silence, must learn to live inside that noise. Music, too, evolves alongside the story. The score, composed by Craig Wedren, starts light and cheeky, full of plucked strings and jazzy rhythms. But as the film grows more sincere, so does the music. Melodies linger longer. Themes begin to repeat, not in parody, but in recognition. One particular cue, a gentle piano motif, is used first in a comedic context, then reprised during a scene where Maximo helps Hugo with his science project late at night. The context transforms it. What once signaled irony now signals care. And then there are the community spaces. The yogurt shop. The car dealership. The frozen yogurt parking lot where Kristen Bell's character delivers her bizarre monologues about lactose intolerance and feline empathy. These locations are strange, grounded, and completely believable. They represent the world Maximo has never paid attention to, a world of people just getting by. The camera treats them with respect. No mockery. No exaggeration. And in doing so, the film quietly critiques the elitism that Maximo once idolized. The film's final setting, the school stage during a talent showcase, brings everything full circle. Here, Maximo is no longer the center of attention. He's part of the audience, part of the family. And when he finally stands up to support Hugo, not with grand gestures, but with quiet presence, the frame shifts again. He is no longer framed alone. He's surrounded, anchored, real. In these final moments, the lighting is soft but bright. The camera holds just a bit longer on every face. The color palette is warm. The music swells, not dramatically, but gently. And the world that once felt so far from Maximo's reach now feels like home. It's easy to overlook the settings in a comedy like this, to see them as mere backdrops for gags. But in truth, they shape everything. They hold the story's heart. They tell us who these people are, how they live, what they value, and, most importantly, how they change. Because when a man like Maximo moves from marble floors to hardwood ones, from spotlight stages to school gyms, from mirrored hallways to messy living rooms, we see something subtle but profound. He hasn't just changed location. He's changed direction, and that's the journey the visuals take us on. One lens flare, one shaky camera, one warm-lit dinner table at a time. Some films are rehearsed to perfection, every line drilled down, every shot storyboard so tightly there's barely space to breathe. But not this one. This story wasn't built in straight lines. It was built in laughter behind the camera, in awkward falls no one planned, in the quiet camaraderie between cast members who found something real in the middle of the absurd. Behind the scenes of this outrageous comedy about vanity, family, and second chances, the production unfolded like a patchwork of improvisation, instinct, and the unexpected magic that happens when everyone believes in something funny and true. From the beginning, the energy on set was unlike anything typical of a Hollywood production. It didn't matter that it was a bilingual crew, or that some of the cast were crossing over into English-language filmmaking for the first time. The common language was comedy and respect. Leading the charge was Eugenio Derbez, not only the star of the film but also its heart. Derbez wore many hats during production. Actor, producer, unintentional motivational speaker, and often, ringleader of chaos. Derbez, already a legend in Mexican television and cinema, was stepping into the American mainstream in a bold way. But instead of pressure, he brought joy. He cracked jokes between takes, improvised relentlessly, and had an uncanny ability to remember everyone's name, from fellow actors to camera assistants to the woman who ran the catering truck. People talk about setting the tone for a shoot. One of the first challenges the production faced was tone. How do you shoot a comedy that starts with a gold-digging gigolo and somehow ends with emotional sincerity? Director Ken Marino, known for his own comedic work, brought a collaborative approach. He wasn't just giving instructions. He was asking questions, testing beats, encouraging chaos. In fact, some of the film's funniest scenes came not from the script, but from moments when Marino simply let the actors go. Kristen Bell's character is the most iconic example. Initially a brief walk-on part, a quirky yogurt shop manager with a thing for cats, she turned the role into a scene-stealing subplot. Her dialogue? Mostly improvised. Her wardrobe? Assembled from a mix of thrift store finds and personal items she brought in herself. The story of her character's obsessive love for coupons and her belief that frozen yogurt had emotional properties wasn't written. It was born on set, one absurd line at a time. Derbez and Bell developed an unshakable comedic chemistry. One scene, meant to be a quick two-line exchange, stretched into a 5-minute riff where Bell described each of her 7 cats by zodiac sign. Marino kept the cameras rolling, and the crew was barely able to keep it together behind the monitor. That take didn't make it into the film in its entirety, but parts of it did. And that's how most of the comedy landed, not because it was planned, but because it was alive. Raquel Welch's role as Celeste, the glamorous widow who kicks Maximo out and sets the story in motion, brought a different kind of energy to the set. Elegant, commanding, and endlessly charming, Welch wasn't just acting, she was owning the room. Yet behind her Hollywood royalty aura was a mischievous spark. She would slide into scenes with one-liners no one expected, often throwing Derbez off just enough to make him break character. In one scene, after Maximo attempts a dramatic monologue about being thrown to the curb like old moisturizer, Welch paused, tilted her head, and deadpanned, "You were never the expensive kind." The crew erupted, the scene had to be reset, and the line made it into the next draft of the script. But not every day was smooth sailing. During one of the film's biggest sequences, a lavish outdoor party featuring pools, cabanas, and a disastrous attempt by Maximo to seduce his way back into high society, a windstorm swept across the location. Tents collapsed. Champagne glasses shattered mid-shot. The lighting rig swayed dangerously until the crew tied it down with sandbags and prayer. Still, Derbez, barefoot in a linen suit, kept improvising as the wind howled, pretending the weather was part of his dramatic aura. That footage was eventually used to punch up a scene that needed a touch of chaos. Sometimes, nature writes the best comedy. The child actor who played Hugo, Raúl Briones Jr., was a quiet storm on set. Young, intuitive, and sharp beyond his years, he formed a bond with Derbez almost instantly. Between takes, they'd practice tongue twisters, trade knock-knock jokes, and play card games on the craft services table. One day, when Derbez was struggling to remember a complex line, Raúl whispered the cue from behind the camera. Derbez smiled, turned to the director, and said, "Give him my salary." Raúl's most emotional scene, where Hugo waits alone at the science fair, was shot after midnight, with half the crew dozing in corners and lighting techs fighting fatigue. But Raúl didn't flinch. His performance was so raw that it made one of the boom operators cry. The crew clapped when the take was finished. Quietly. Respectfully. As if they knew they'd just caught something rare. There was also the time the catering van was accidentally towed because it was parked in a restricted zone during a location shoot. The production was forced to improvise lunch with gas station sandwiches and vending machine snacks. Derbez, ever the showman, turned the disaster into a comedy bit, standing on a folding chair and narrating each sandwich option like it was fine cuisine. Ah, yes, the turkey mystery meat with a hint of regret, perfect for today's emotional arc. And then, of course, there was the infamous pool scene. It was meant to be a moment of peak humiliation for Maximo, a symbolic fall from grace as he tries to charm his way into a socialite's heart and ends up soaked, alone, and shivering. But on the first take, the water was too warm. Derbez didn't react with the expected shock. So the crew cooled the pool with ice, waited an hour, and tried again. This time, the cold was real. The reaction. Hilarious. He leapt in with a scream so theatrical it echoed across the entire neighborhood. That shot, frozen teeth and all, is what ended up in the movie. Throughout the shoot, the crew operated like a family. A loud, bilingual, over-caffeinated family. Birthdays were celebrated with mariachi music and donut cakes. When a key grip lost his wallet, the entire set paused for 20 minutes to help him find it. When a lighting technician's car broke down, the lead makeup artist offered hers without question. It wasn't just professionalism, it was connection. Everyone knew they were making something funny. But more than that, they knew they were making something meaningful. Because behind the laughs, the story being told was one everyone recognized. Falling from grace. Trying to find your worth without a spotlight. Learning how to show up for someone else. These weren't just plot points, they were truths. And the cast and crew treated them that way. On the final day of shooting, as the sun set over the last exterior location, Derbez gathered everyone. Grips, drivers, costume designers, background extras, and stood on a plastic crate. He didn't give a speech full of platitudes. Instead, he said simply, "We made something kind. And that's rare." Then he took a selfie with the entire crew, stood in the center of the frame, and shouted, "Say awkward family!" That photo, blown up and framed, now sits in the lobby of the production office. A reminder of a film made in laughter and humility. Of a story that went from absurdity to honesty. Of a set where egos were left at the door, and everyone, from the lead actor to the PA holding a boom mic under a towel during the rain, played their part in something greater than comedy. They made something kind. And you could feel it in every shot, every gag, every quiet beat that landed not because it was scripted, but because it was real. Some films chase spectacle. Others chase sentiment. But every so often, a story dances between the two, splashing its screen with colors and charm, while whispering truths about who we are beneath our gloss, our routines, our carefully cultivated images. This is one of those stories. A comedy on the surface, absurd and flamboyant, yet underneath, a quietly reflective fable about ego, identity, and the kind of love that doesn't come wrapped in romance or reward. To truly understand the heart of it, we have to step past the punchlines and look into the architecture of its soul, its themes and its symbols, the emotional scaffolding that holds it all together. At the core of this film is a question far more existential than it first appears. What is a man worth when everything he's used to define himself is gone? It's a story about love. Not the dramatic, fireworks in the rain kind, but the kind that sits beside you at the dinner table. That helps with homework. That buys the telescope, even when money's tight. That shows up late, but shows up. The kind that says, "I see you. I'm here." And that, in all its messy, hilarious, wonderful imperfection, is what makes these characters unforgettable. Some movies arrive polished, clean, like they were assembled in a studio with precision and careful planning. Others, like this one, stumble onto the screen with the same endearing chaos they try to capture in their story. Making a film that blends slapstick comedy, heartfelt family drama, and the satirical glare of a gigolo's downfall is no small feat, and as it turns out, what happened behind the scenes was often just as bizarre, unexpected, and strangely sweet as what unfolded on camera. For starters, the lead actor's transformation into Maximo was more than just a role. It was a reinvention. Known largely for his Spanish-language performances and dramatic television presence, this film marked his leap into a broad, English-language comedy that asked for more than just timing. It asked for swagger. For vulnerability wrapped in vanity. for comedy that played on stereotypes without falling into them. In preparing for the role, he studied not just comedic technique, but the very nature of male ego. He told interviewers later that he built Maximo from every gym mirror selfie, every cologne ad, every man who's ever winked at his own reflection. And if you think that over-the-top walk, that exaggerated posture, and that too smooth way of sipping from a wine glass were invented for the screen, think again. Those were real-life observations, stitched together into a man so convinced of his own appeal, he could seduce a wall. The costume department had their own adventure bringing Maximo to life. His wardrobe is an ecosystem of silk, velvet, leather, and open chests. But many of those clothes weren't just selected, they were custom-made. Not because they had to be, but because nothing off the rack could match the flamboyance the role demanded. There was a jacket, lime green with golden embroidery, that became a running joke among the cast and crew. It was so tight that the actor couldn't raise his arms above his shoulders, leading to a scene being rewritten on the fly when he couldn't reach for a drink prop during a party sequence. They worked around it, pretending Maximo was too entitled to reach for his own wine, and it somehow made the moment even funnier. Then there was the scene at the science fair. On paper, it's one of the film's emotional high points, a grand finale where family, pride, and second chances collide. But in reality, it was chaos. Shot in a real elementary school over the course of 3 nights, the production had to deal with unexpected fire drills, a faulty sprinkler system that went off during a take, and a swarm of bees that descended on the catering table mid-scene. At one point, extras playing judges broke character to swat at insects, and the footage was so hilarious that it nearly made it into the blooper reel. The crew ended up shooting the key emotional moment, the reconciliation between Maximo and Hugo, at 3 a.m., with actors running on nothing but granola bars and stubborn willpower. And yet, somehow, that sleepy sincerity gave the scene an honesty no one anticipated. Kristen Bell's role in the film was supposed to be smaller, just a one-off gag appearance as a frozen yogurt employee with an obsession for cats and coupon books. But once she stepped on set and started improvising, everything changed. Her character became a recurring presence, someone whose oddball charm provided a needed contrast to Maximo's flamboyant self-importance. The actress reportedly came up with nearly all of her dialogue on the spot, riffing with the cast between takes, often causing the crew to break into laughter mid-shot. The cat hoodie? Her idea. The framed photo of her cat in the store? Brought from home. What started as a footnote became one of the film's most delightfully weird running jokes. There was also the curious case of the parrot. In one scene, eventually cut from the final version, Maximo is meant to be living with an elderly woman who owns a parrot trained to repeat mildly inappropriate affirmations. The idea was that the parrot, having spent years overhearing motivational tapes and flirtatious compliments, had absorbed a strange hybrid dialect of positivity and pick-up lines. The bird was supposed to yell things like, "You're worth it, sugar hips," or "Confidence begins in the loins." Unfortunately, the parrot cast for the role became wildly unpredictable. It refused to speak on cue, often shrieked in terror at the boom mic, and once bit an assistant director so hard filming was paused for half a day. The bird was eventually replaced with a plush prop and dubbed in post-production, but the original idea remains one of the strangest production hiccups the crew still laughs about. One of the film's most touching behind-the-scenes realities came not from the actors, but from the children cast as Hugo's classmates. Many were local hires, chosen not for acting experience but for personality. During the shoot, the filmmakers hosted science workshops between takes, teaching the kids real experiments with baking soda volcanoes and model rockets. The goal was to keep their energy authentic, and the results were extraordinary. In one improvised scene, a child accidentally set off a homemade baking soda explosion early. The reaction was so genuine that the footage was kept, and the explosion was worked into the final cut as if it were part of the script. It wasn't. It was just real. Another lesser-known fact involves the actor who played the young version of Maximo in the opening montage. The child, dressed in faux leather and fake gold, delivered his scenes with such unblinking confidence that the crew began calling him Mini Maximo. In a rare moment of pure cinematic poetry, the young actor approached the lead after wrapping his scenes and asked, with deadly seriousness, "Do I get to keep the mustache?" He did. It became a keepsake from a performance that was both hilarious and, somehow, heartbreakingly believable. The director, Ken Marino, approached the entire film with the heart of a fan and the mind of a juggler. Known primarily for his comedic work, this project marked one of his largest directing efforts. He famously referred to the production as a circus with an emotional core. He encouraged improvisation, rewrote scenes the night before shooting, and often filmed alternate versions of jokes just in case one fell flat. Some of the film's best lines came from moments when the cast was simply trying to make each other laugh. One scene in particular, where Maximo attempts to seduce a yoga instructor by performing a botched handstand, was completely unplanned. The actor fell hard and stayed in character. The reaction from the instructor was real, a mix of horror and disbelief. It was too perfect not to use. And then there was the rap party. Maximo's journey begins with a life that seems enviable. A mansion, tailored clothes, a luxurious car, and the kind of ease that suggests he's cracked the code to happiness. But from the very first scene, we realize it's a facade. A delicate illusion, built not on success or skill, but on seduction and survival. Maximo has based his entire self-worth on being wanted, desired, kept. It's not just vanity. It's identity. And that, right there, is the central theme, identity as performance. He's a man who has spent decades playing a role. The Latin lover. The eternal bachelor. The object of desire. But when he's replaced, swiftly, brutally, by someone younger, the character collapses. And suddenly, we're left not with the performer, but the man beneath. A man who has no script, no direction, and no idea how to be without applause. The collapse of Maximo's lifestyle is not simply a comedic device, it's a symbolic death. The mansion he's evicted from isn't just a home. It's a mausoleum of his ego. Every piece of furniture, every mirror, every manicured shrub is part of the stage he's built around himself. So when he is stripped of it all, it's not just a financial loss, it's a spiritual unraveling. The forced return to his sister's modest home marks a descent into unfamiliar terrain, both physically and emotionally. And that home, Sarah's home, is the beating heart of the film's symbolic world. It represents everything Maximo has avoided: stability, responsibility, imperfection. The walls are filled with real-life clutter. School papers, family photos, mismatched furniture. It is not curated. It is lived in. And it stands in stark contrast to the curated perfection he once called his. Symbolically, this house is more than a location. It is a crucible. A space where the superficial must give way to substance, or be consumed by its own emptiness. Sarah herself embodies the theme of unseen strength. She is the opposite of Maximo in every way. She works hard. She sacrifices. She doesn't perform, she provides. And her strength is quiet, often thankless. In a world that celebrates flash, she moves in the shadows, unnoticed but unshakable. Her relationship with Maximo is not built on affection, but expectation. She expects him to change, to wake up, to grow. And that expectation, while never spoken aloud, is part of the film's emotional gravity. She is the moral compass not through speeches, but through presence, through boundary, through the kind of love that doesn't coddle. Then there is Hugo, the boy, the spark, the mirror. If Maximo is the film's ego, Hugo is its heart. A young boy navigating his own insecurities, trying to impress a girl not with swagger but with science. He represents innocence in search of value. And in a beautiful twist of fate, he turns to Maximo for guidance. Not because Maximo has proven himself, but because Hugo, in his youthful optimism, still believes people can change. That belief is one of the film's most poignant symbols. Hope not as delusion, but as choice. Their relationship becomes the narrative's emotional engine. At first, Maximo sees Hugo as a tool, a stepping stone to seduce someone rich. But slowly, as the lessons shift from manipulation to mentorship, something honest begins to bloom. Maximo teaches Hugo how to walk with confidence, how to speak with charm. Hugo teaches Maximo how to show up, how to try, how to care. It is in these exchanges that the film's most powerful theme takes shape: redemption through responsibility. Redemption doesn't come to Maximo because he has a change of heart. It comes because he fails. Repeatedly. He fails to be present. He fails to understand. He fails to protect. And in those failures, he finally begins to listen, to learn, to take responsibility for someone other than himself. Not in a grand, heroic way, but in small human gestures. Fixing a science project, cooking a terrible dinner, standing in the audience when it counts. One of the film's most symbolic moments is the science fair. It's not just an event. It's a battlefield of validation. For Hugo, it's the moment he hopes to be seen. For Maximo, it's the test of whether he can be there, not as a star, but as support. When he fails to arrive on time, the emotional impact lands with quiet devastation. But that moment, Hugo standing alone, is not a conclusion. It's a pivot. It forces Maximo to confront the reality that presence matters more than presentation. That loyalty speaks louder than any flirtation. When Maximo finally returns, it's without flair. No flowers. No tuxedos. Just a man holding a gift he chose with thought, not seduction. A telescope. A tool for looking outward. For dreaming. It is, symbolically, the opposite of a mirror. And that matters. Because Maximo has spent his life looking inward, obsessed with his reflection. But the telescope marks a shift, a willingness to look beyond himself. To wonder. To witness. To care. And then there's the theme of age, subtle, but ever-present. This is not a film about a young man discovering who he is. It's about an older man realizing who he could have been. Maximo's aging is not hidden. It's central to his arc. The dye in his hair, the pain in his back, the desperation in his flirting. All of it speaks to a fear that he has become irrelevant. And the film doesn't cure that fear by making him young again. It challenges him to find value not in his looks, but in his legacy. In the impact he leaves, not the impression he makes. Symbolism seeps into even the film's smallest details. The yogurt shop, where Kristen Bell's character reigns supreme, is more than a running gag. It's a symbol of the absurdity of control, of the comfort people find in tiny rituals. The cats, the coupons, the self-help quotes scrawled on the walls, all of it reflects the human need for meaning in the mundane. And Maximo, for all his disbelief, is slowly drawn into that world. It grounds him, reminds him that ridiculousness doesn't make something worthless. Sometimes it makes it bearable. Even Maximo's wardrobe is symbolic. He begins the film in gaudy ensembles, bold colors, shimmering fabrics, shoes too expensive to walk in. But as the story unfolds, his clothing becomes less about spectacle and more about function. By the final act, he's wearing jeans, t-shirts, sneakers. Clothes that blend in. Clothes that serve a purpose. It's not a costume anymore, it's a choice. And that shift, silent and visual, speaks volumes. The final symbol, the one that lingers long after the credits roll, is the idea of home. Not the mansion. Not the guest room. But the dinner table. The couch where people pile in to watch TV. The awkward silences that come with real relationships. That's the home Maximo finds, not because he earns it, but because he keeps returning to it, even after failure. It's not a place of perfection. It's a place of persistence. And in that home, surrounded by a sister who finally forgives, a boy who never stopped believing, and a life he never imagined wanting, Maximo becomes someone real. Not because he stopped performing, but because he finally learned who he was performing for. This isn't just a film about laughter. It's about the long, uncomfortable, often hilarious path to becoming someone who matters. Someone who's seen. Someone who sees. And that, in the end, is the story's greatest theme. That you are not the sum of who you've impressed, but who you've stood by.